Before I introduce the next keynote speaker, very briefly, for those of you who may have came in a little bit late, we have American Sign Language interpretation that we are pinning and spotlighting accordingly, so you should be able to see them at all times. Keep in mind, if you're viewing on a phone, you might have some difficulty when there are shared screens, but we will do our best to continue spotlighting. We have live captioning at the bottom of the screen. If you select CC, you can turn on, enlarge, or view a full transcript of captions. And we also have Spanish interpretation. So if you go to the bottom and you the bottom of the webinar, select the globe icon, and you can toggle on Spanish interpretation. With that being said, it's my pleasure to introduce the first keynote speaker this morning, Daniel Dawes, the Executive Director of Satcher Health Leadership Institute at Morehouse School of Medicine, and author of The Political Determinants of Health. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction and for the invitation to speak. I am honored to join you all for this very special symposium. You know, it's a little over 50 years ago that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. reminded us that of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health is the most shocking and inhumane. And it is for this reason why I want to focus my remarks on how we can repair the past and advance a more healthy, equitable, and inclusive society. If you are ready to move beyond merely nibbling around the edges of the problem of health inequities in our country and effect more meaningful and effective solutions, then join me as we take a look at how these inequities were concretized in our systems, institutions, and communities over time. With your leadership and advocacy, we can eliminate compounded disparities for people with disabilities, and we can, more importantly, move the needle of health equity forward by understanding and leveraging the political determinants of health. Thankfully, there have always been individuals in this country, and I know many of you, in fact, have been, who have fought for a more equitable and inclusive society. In the health space, we have defined equity as implying that ideally everyone should have a fair opportunity to attain their full health potential, and more pragmatically, that no one should be disadvantaged from achieving this potential. Thankfully, Professor Tawara Good and her colleagues at the National Center for Cultural Competence at Georgetown University has further defined this, has actually expanded this definition, proposing a more comprehensive definition of equity relative to intellectual and developmental disabilities. She defines this as the absence of systematic disparities and unjust systemic policies and practices that unfairly disadvantage individuals with developmental disabilities and their families, while unfairly advantaging individuals and families without such disabilities, in the pursuit of what is needed to be fully productive, included, and valued members of their communities. Well, how do we reach this audacious goal of health equity? When for too long, as you can see on this slide, Lady Columbia or Lady Justice representing the United States, for too long, many racial and ethnic minorities, people with disabilities, and other vulnerable and marginalized groups have found themselves in a precarious situation. Their health, their lives, literally hanging in the balance. Many of them falling through the cracks of our health system, educational system, human services system, housing, behavioral health, and employment systems, among others. They've struggled to live in a society that has intentionally erected barrier after barrier to weaken their bodies and hasten their deaths. For over 400 years in this country, these groups have experienced inequities throughout the life course, from womb to tomb. Today, the inequities in health and healthcare are widely documented, as you can see on your screen. A recent study showed that children with developmental disabilities are slightly more likely to die from COVID-19. And the majority of kids, almost 80% who have died from COVID-19, are racial and ethnic minorities. Interestingly, in addition to that, adults with disabilities are 3 times more likely to die from COVID-19 than those without disabilities. So I want to share a story with you, highlighting what I think is an incredible case for why we must continue to push for health equity in America, and why, with the privilege and the power that each of us have, that we must use it to advance the cause. Here's April Dunn's story. From being born with fetal alcohol syndrome and cerebral palsy, to being placed for adoption at 5 months old, to being denied the opportunity to graduate from high school because she could not pass a standardized test, despite being an honor roll student, to advocating to provide alternative graduation paths for students with disabilities, which led to testifying and working to pass public policies in her home state and landing a job with Disability Affairs Department in her state department. At 33 years old, April was 3 times more likely to die of COVID-19 than a person without her conditions. And as a Black woman, she was 3 times more likely to die than a white man due to COVID-19. Within less than 2 weeks. 2 weeks after contracting COVID-19, April tragically passed away as a result of the devastating effects of COVID-19. The inequities you see that predate COVID did not suddenly appear, nor are they inapplicable, especially in April's story. Minorities, people with disabilities, and other vulnerable communities still contend with neighborhoods that are largely devoid of necessary health protective and health sustaining resources. And they're still contending with the political determinants or drivers that have been perpetuating and exacerbating these health inequities. So why is this happening? Why? We know that racial and ethnic minorities, people with disabilities, lower socioeconomic status individuals, LGBTQ plus individuals, and others die disproportionately each year. And the toll that it takes is unconscionable. But one thing that we must always remember is that in the United States, the nation's health is not an organic outcome. It is not a coincidence that certain groups of Americans experience higher premature death rates or poor health outcomes than others. Why? Well, today we recognize that there are a variety of forces that collectively impact our health and determine the quality and the extent of our lives on this earth. They include the social determinants of health, environmental, economic, behavioral health, healthcare, and genetic factors. And yes, it is true that air pollution, climate change, toxic waste sites, unclean water, a lack of fresh fruits and vegetables, unsafe, unsecure, and unstable housing, poor quality education, inaccessible transportation, a lack of parks and other recreational areas, and other factors play a role in our overall health and well-being. If they are not managed well, they increase our stress. They expose us to harmful elements, and they limit our opportunities to thrive. You see, key among these determinants are the social determinants of health, which are the structural conditions in which we are born into, we live in, and we die in, that affect all aspects of our health. But underlying each one, really, is a political determinant of health that created these human-made, pre-existing inequities. You see, too often we've been stopping at the social drivers of inequities, failing to look back and dig even further to see the depths of the problem and understand its root causes and distribution. And as a result, we've been missing the link between the social determinants of health and their policy roots. So I want to tell another story. Let me illustrate this concept, right? With a short story. If you were to envision all of society sitting on the banks of a mighty river, fishing and finding nourishment in the resources that the river provides, The health inequities that we face are represented by the differences in the caliber and quantity of fish we encounter. Some people have a bounty of healthy fish and vegetation to feed off of, while others may only have small fish, no vegetation, or malnourished fish. Different people having access to different types of resources and different parts of the river represents the social determinants of health. You see, some people are located in a slower moving part of the river by no fault of their own. Others are located in more lush parts of the river and benefit because of such by specific decisions that were made on their behalf. These are the political determinants of health. You see, somewhere upstream, decisions were made to divert the river to benefit certain people and harm others. And decisions were made to place certain types of people on specific banks of the river while placing others elsewhere. These upstream decisions have downstream impacts. This pandemic demonstrates the inconvenient and harsh truth about the impact of these determinants of health and how collectively these factors significantly contribute to our society's health inequities. It shows the compounding effect of political determinants over personal responsibility. How? Well, because no matter how much many African Americans, Native Hawaiians, Latinx Americans, Asian and Pacific Islander Americans, and lower socioeconomic status individuals try to act responsibly, there are always structural, institutional, interpersonal, and yes, even intrapersonal obstacles that have been hindering them. Beneath these communities' notice have been political determinants that have pulled and continue to pull strings that prevent them from achieving their optimal health and full potential. And so is it any wonder then why COVID-19 has not been striking all groups equally? Well, no, because our current economic and social policies have not been benefiting all groups equally. Think about it. Early on in the pandemic, who was able to get access to the COVID tests? How about access to the vaccine right now? Access to healthcare, the quality of care, access to the internet, and even simple things that we may take for granted, like accessing water and accessing food, are all politically determined. You see, April's story, in effect, highlights how one political determinant after another resulted in a continual tightening of a chokehold on her community and the eventual disaster that brought to light the inequities plaguing it. High obesity rates, diabetes, maternal mortality, depression, and many other health issues can be firmly linked back to political action or inaction. By understanding the political determinants of health, their origins, their impact, and their interconnection with the social determinants of health, we will be better equipped to develop and implement actionable solutions to close the health gap. You know, what April's story shows us is that behind virtually every health disparity and subsequent death, especially during this time of COVID-19, there were specific and insidious political determinants of health that led to the person's premature death. For a moment, I want to paint a picture of the tree of health with you. Initially, you may notice on your screen a tree, the fruits on this tree, the individuals or even the tombstones surrounding the tree. But actually, this picture is far more representative of what our society currently has to offer some of its most vulnerable people. The tree represents society. You see, there have always been co-laborers in the fight for health equity. Many of you, in fact, I know, are co-laborers who have tended to the tree during your lives. We have worked tirelessly to feed the tree evidence-based policies, programs, and practices with the hope that the tree would provide fruit that would benefit all of society. However, the reality is that there also been others who have been working overtime to supply the tree with that which would do it harm. These are the roots that are undergirded by racism, ableism, classism, sexism, and many other deleterious motives. From the bottom of the tree's base, all the way up and through to the ends of its branches, what is supplied to the tree eventually is multiplied by the tree. So now, due to the root causes of inequities, the fruit represent higher rates of diabetes, inaccessible housing, a lack of nutritious food, and any other number of those outcomes that we discussed. And as that poisonous and sometimes rotted fruit falls to the ground, the tree that had the potential to provide life-giving nourishment to all who encountered it now only leaves death and destruction in its shadow from one generation to the next. Well, I hope all hope is not lost, because now I want you to imagine what could and should have been. The roots of the tree, which anchors the tree and is supposed to absorb nutrients from the soil, represent the political determinants of health. And the detrimental factors that the tree's roots were absorbing from the soil include racism, sexism, classism, and many other evils. Every political and policy decision that is made feeds into the tree, yielding fruit which permeates throughout our society. But imagine if the tree of health is rooted in health equity. The end result is a society that is nourished, cared for, and capable of achieving its full potential. So this begs the question, how did we get here? How is it that inequality gets under our skin, leading to accelerated aging in our bodies or biological weathering, as Dr. Arlene Geronimus at the University of Michigan has coined? How is it that it increases our rates of chronic diseases, as David Williams at Harvard and other scholars have identified, destroying the social and the economic fabric of many of our neighborhoods? Well, let's talk about how these structural conditions in which we live in and we are dying in actually were created to begin with. Let's go back 400 years. We're going to look at big P policy and little p policy, governmental and non-governmental policy. I think many of us are quite aware that in the 1600s, there was an attempt by the economic interest, the business interest, wanting to sustain their business model of slavery. They worked in concert with policymakers, the early colonies, Massachusetts becoming the first one to adopt a law that legalized this horrific institution, followed by Connecticut and New York and other colonies. And as if that were not enough, right, to keep a group of Black individuals down, no, these policymakers went further by developing, implementing, and enforcing additional policies that were intended to prohibit Black and Indigenous populations from being able to address their social determinants of health. So these laws explicitly prohibited Black and Native Americans from socializing with one another, from walking at night without passes or without lanterns. They were prohibited by law in the early colonies from raising their own food, earning their own money, from learning to read and write, from being educated. They were prohibited by policies from moving more than beyond a 1 mile radius on the plantation. These policies were then recycled from one generation to the next, one century to the next. And we know that through epigenetic research, the impact of slavery has been associated with long-term impacts on contemporary mortality, poverty, heart disease, maternal and infant mortality, etc. We know then that Jim Crow reared its ugly head with a vengeance into the 1800s. And through these explicitly racist laws were again developed and implemented and enforced to keep these marginalized groups from being able to realize their full potential, from being able to address their determinants of health. Today, we see a direct link to aggressive breast cancer prevalence in African American women from that time period. We know then that there was an attempt to move away once abolitionists, once health equity leaders, civil rights leaders pushed back on these racist laws and said it's a violation of our Equal Protection Clause in the Constitution. We know then that policymakers said, fine, it is a violation, and you can no longer enact racially discriminatory policies. But as we have seen, racists in this country are quite clever, and they worked assiduously over time to create policies that, although were facially neutral policies, they weren't explicitly racist on their face. Once they were implemented, they had the same or desired effect of discriminating against these population groups. So let's talk about that for a moment. We know that after World War I, the country was in a state of panic. We know that the country was malnourished. We know that there were issues with housing, all of these social conditions or structural conditions that we're talking about, transportation, housing. There was a crisis. And we know that the Franklin D. Roosevelt government went about enacting policies that were designed to enhance the general welfare of the population. Well, that's all fine and dandy, but in addition to those positive developments, there were also the development of policies that again had a disproportionately negative impact on Black and Brown communities in this country. So let me take you into the early 1930s. I want to bring up as an example the Homeowners Loan Corporation Act that basically was created by Congress, signed into law by the administration at that time, and implemented in concert with state and local policymakers. This law essentially authorized property appraisers in over 200 cities in America to go into the neighborhoods of these cities and to grade them from a scale of A, B, C, or D. A being the most desirable communities. These were your green communities on the maps, as you see. These were your affluent white communities. Your B communities were your were your actual blue communities, and these communities were your middle class white communities. Your C communities were your quote unquote undesirable immigrant communities, as they were classified then. And they were basically the Mexican, Cuban, Jewish, Italian, Asian, German communities at the time. And then the red communities were your D communities. These communities were your predominantly African American communities, and they were classified, quote unquote, hazardous. Well, once these reports were aggregated, they were then sent back to the federal government, which then in turn used them to create additional policies that starved these redline communities, predominantly Black and Brown communities, of the resources that they needed by preventing them from accessing FHA and VA home mortgage loans. So as if these communities had not been struggling already, you had an act of additional policies to prevent their full potential. Well, right after that, we also saw the development and implementation of additional policies after World War II, this time designed to bolster the infrastructure of the country. Many of you may notice, for those of you who were born into or live in or work in communities of color, you may have noticed a major highway cutting right through the middle of these communities, splitting the neighborhood in half, essentially, right? You may have in New York City, for instance, recognized that 6 of the 7 bus depots in Manhattan were located in Harlem, a predominantly Black and Brown community. And you may have noticed in other communities, Ohio and Detroit and other places, train tracks essentially cutting these neighborhoods in half, or parking lots that were disproportionately placed in these communities, toxic waste sites, factories, etc. Today, through public health research, we recognize that many of these Black and Brown communities are breathing in the most polluted air. And as a result, they have the highest rates of asthma, right, in this country. Well, it's also interesting, we've been able to tie these higher rates of asthma to these infrastructure, these highways, these bus depots, these parking lots, et cetera, train tracks. But again, we must ask ourselves, how did these structural conditions come to be in the first place? If you dig further, you will recognize that there is a direct connection to a policy. It was not an accident that these structures were located into these communities. It was an act of policy. Today, we also know from the Highway Act that created these highways to the Housing Act that created a urban renewal program and displaced over 500,000 African Americans in this country. We also see the effect that it has today in the form of a poverty tax with higher payments for auto insurance in these redline communities, higher rates for home mortgage loans, lower property appraisals. We also see the effect in these communities in terms of deserts, food, pharmacy, and hospital deserts, making it more difficult to access resources to improve health and maintain health. And now we're also seeing a new phenomenon, right? From redlining to blue lining these communities in the form of climate gentrification, which again is displacing hundreds of thousands of racial and ethnic minorities and people with disabilities in this country. So we've talked about how policy has been a driving force for many of the health inequities that we realize today in this country. But we also know that policy has been a tool for elevating health equity in America. And so I want to quickly talk about this. You know, William Faulkner, the great Southern writer, says that the past is never dead. How true is that, right? As we've gone through this quadruple pandemic, he says it's not even past. It is always here among us. And so let me go back to a period in 1789, once the United States government was formally organized as a constitutional republic. A group of abolitionists, mental health reformers, advocates for people with disabilities, and homeless individuals came together, pleading with our federal government to enact policies that would provide for the general welfare of its people. Well, if you think that we are having a very contentious debate over this health equity agenda, at the time it was equally, if not more contentious, based on the records. People were upset. At that time, the abolitionists, the mental health reformers, and others decided to recruit a major policy influencer, and they approached Benjamin Franklin. They said, Benjamin, would you use your power and privilege, your platform, to help us move this agenda? And he said, sure. They said, great. Well, would you sign this petition? And in this petition, they basically advocated for not only the abolition of slavery, but to stop the separation of children from their mothers and the breakup of these enslaved families. They wanted the law to provide for the necessities of life, food and clothing, to provide medical services, education, true employment opportunities, among others. Well, when Congress received the petition, they were upset. How dare you, Benjamin, bring up these issues when you know that we're just getting settled? Now is not the right time, they argued. And they actually created what we call the confederalism argument, stating that the states should be the ones to decide what's in the best interest because they are closest to the people in their jurisdictions. So they should be affecting the policies, essentially. Well, we know that argument is thrown out the door once it is pertaining to a certain group of people, right? A more privileged group of people. Unfortunately, in this case, 4 weeks after Congress responded to Benjamin Franklin and these advocates, Benjamin Franklin died. And that was the first time in U.S. history that the light of health equity had dimmed in public policy attempts. It would take us 75 years later to realize the nation's first health policy that was intended to move this health equity agenda forward with the passage of the Freedmen's Bureau Act. It was a law that took 2 years of negotiation during the Civil Rights Movement, or during the Civil War, rather. And during that time, President Lincoln and his supporters negotiated as best as they could for all of the things that the advocates wanted back in 1789. This time they got it all. But there was one provision that was most contentious. That was the provision to provide health services to newly freed people and to poor whites who had been displaced as a result of the Civil War. Well, unfortunately, in this case too, after signing this bill into law, and after compromising and striking the provision to provide medical care, President Lincoln was assassinated. But his supporters, not wanting to squander that crisis, believed that upon reading that Freedmen's Bureau Act, that it did provide them with the authority to provide health services and all of the other necessities that are necessary to address their social needs, right? And so they went about implementing this law. Well, as we have seen in this country, racism does not sleep. It's working overtime. And the opponents of health equity at that time basically fought tooth and nail every day that law was in existence to undermine it. And finally, after 7 years, they succeeded. We know from history that it would take 150 years later before we'd have another bite at the apple, before we'd be able to realize another inclusive and comprehensive, equity-focused health policy with the passage of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. Thankfully, we have seen too attempts at bolstering reforms for people with disabilities over this nation's history. We know that, for instance, with mental health reform, there was an attempt initially to push the agenda. Dorothea Dixon, others fought for years, for decades, to get the bill for the benefit of the indigent insane passed. Unfortunately, they also were ignored by the federal government. It would take 150 years after the founding of this country, after 3 major wars, before the government would recognize how important mental health is to our systemic health. Well, for the sake of time, let me end by discussing how we can leverage the political determinants of health. You've heard me talk about the political determinants of health, and let me just quickly define this, right? I define the political determinants of health as involving the systematic process of structuring relationships, of distributing resources, and third, of administering power, operating simultaneously in ways to mutually reinforce or influence one another to advance or hinder health equity. Let's talk about this very quickly. Structuring relationships. We talked about redlining in America through the Homeowners Loan Corporation Act. But there are a host of other policies that were designed, the anti-miscegenation laws in this country, designed to keep population groups from mixing. The blood quantum requirement laws intended to keep American Indians from mixing with the general population. Our immigration laws steeped in racist ideology. Policies that were preventing children with disabilities from receiving education in schools, or preventing accessible housing for these individuals, among others. Secondly, when you think about the distribution of resources, think about it in terms of the appropriations of federal, state, and local discretionary and non-discretionary funding, right? And programs. We know when you think about it, health services, special education has been terribly funded, has always been underfunded in this country. Home and community-based services, amongst many others. Think about the administration of power, right? We know that redistricting, gerrymandering, including restricting ballot access, voter suppression tactics, voter identification laws, purging voter rolls of irregular voters, all of these prevent folks from engaging in a critical process, in the political process. And this matters because voting can be the difference between life and death for many of our communities. Well, let me also share with you very briefly my model, the political determinants of health model, based on the evidence from a historical, legal, political science, and public health lens. The bottom line here is that once a perceived health inequity is identified, you must conduct your due diligence to ascertain whether the health outcome is systemic, avoidable, and unjust. How far can you venture to understand whether it is an institutional or structural barrier that created, is perpetuating or exacerbating the inequity? What is the policy change desired? And can you demonstrate the value of investing in change? Why is that important? Because in our country, in the United States, advocates must understand the disquieting and harsh truth that the political determinants of health inequities have rarely been addressed unless their reduction or elimination served other purposes. You see, the success of any advocacy effort depends on how palatable they are to commercial interests and whether there is an investment value to the government. Think about it. Well, let me close by offering you 5 things that we can do to elevate health equity in America. The good news is that structural barriers that we've been talking about and the resulting inequities are not permanent. That's wonderful. But it's going to take greater action and collective agreement from all of us committed to stomping out inequities, to formulate the strategies and the policies that will affect those actionable solutions, those meaningful changes that we need. So here are 5 things. First, we've got to engage in tough conversations around race, place, and class, and intersectionality with disability, and advocate for a full commitment to tackling health inequities upstream in all areas. Then we have to work upstream to address the social and the political determinants of health inequities, understanding when they are at play. That matters. We must go further upstream and connect the social determinants of health to their political roots. Then we must also engage in researching the history of our communities and address the past policies and programs at all levels that created these inequities, remembering that exclusion has always been easier to realize in policy than inclusion. And we must do a better job strengthening our networks and engagement. In particular, disability groups must reach out to communities of color. They must reach out and expand that umbrella of inclusivity so that all groups stand a fair chance of reaching their optimal level of health. And then lastly, we must understand that health equity begins and it's going to end with the political determinants of health. Health inequities and health injustices in America will continue to persist like they have for generations unless we seriously tackle the root causes or upstream factors, notably the political determinants of health. And so I want to leave you with this final thought from my dear friend and mentor, David Thatcher, who was our 16th U.S. Surgeon General. He reminds me very frequently that we need leaders now more than ever who first care enough. You have to care about these issues that are impacting our most marginalized groups. But it's not only enough to care, you have to know enough. You have to study these drivers, these political determinants of health. And as you've seen from this presentation, it takes tremendous courage in this health equity movement. This movement is not for the faint of heart. And so it's going to take courage to do enough. And we must persevere until the job is done. I hope today that we have such leaders in the sound of my voice who are committed to moving that needle further for health equity than we have been able to realize ever before in this country. I want to thank you all again for the privilege of your time, and I want to thank the AHRC and Pace University for the opportunity to provide these remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that incredible commentary, history lesson, and roadmap for what we need to do moving forward. We have hundreds of people here today, and I hope that we can continue this conversation and continue to help educate people. So thank you very much, Daniel, for that. Just a brief note. So as far as questions go, We have been receiving questions before this has started. We have received questions in advance, and we are looking to answer some of those. And we do see that there are people who are asking questions in the chat. And just because of time, flow, and a handful of other things, we might not be able to get to everyone. So I just want to, please continue to ask questions, but understand we might not be able to get to all of them. So thank you so much for that. Moving forward, we are now going to start with our first session, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Tawara Good, the moderator for our first session, Compounded Disparities Through the Lens of Lived Experience and the Political Determinants of Health. Professor, thank you so much for moderating this panel, and it's my pleasure to turn it over to you, so thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, very much. And I am inviting, and I can't see if I am on my screen, all of the panelists to please be on video at this time. There's Judy, Brittany, and Lydia. Okay, all right. So I'm still responding to my colleague Daniel Dawes's call to us, and that recitation of history, and really looking at how policies impact our lives. And so with that, we have an outstanding panel that includes Brittany Wilson, who's an associate professor of law and director of the Civil Rights and Disability Justice Clinic at New York Law School. Welcome. And we should have, don't see her yet, don't see Lydia yet on screen. Lydia Brown, a disability justice advocate, organizer, educator, attorney, strategist, and writer, and more. And also Judy Heumann, international disability advocate and founder of Disabled in Action. They will respond to Daniel's keynote address and really look at the implications of the political determinants of health through the lens of lived experience. And so with that, we will go ahead and get started. And if someone can please send me a chat message to see whether or not Lydia has been able to join us. So I will ask Brittany first, and then Judy to describe themselves for our audience today.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Brittany Wilson. My pronouns are she, her. As Tawara said, I'm an associate professor of law and the director of the new Civil Rights and Disability Justice Clinic at New York Law School. I'm also a civil rights litigator. For my image description, I'm a Black woman with twists in my hair. I wear glasses, and I'm sitting in front of a blue wall.
Thank you, Brittany. Judy?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Judy Heumann. I am living in Washington, D.C. I am a white 73-year-old disabled woman who uses a motorized wheelchair. I have brown hair, a little bit below my shoulders. I'm wearing a print blouse, which is got different shades of browns and mustards, and I'm a little colorblind, I think, so I won't be able to give you the descriptors of all the colors in my blouse. And we're in the foyer of our apartment and surrounded by family pictures and postcards. And then for those of you who can see in the back, this is also our office and dining room table. And Stevie, if you could pick up Stevie, is there, and they are working. And we have plants in the background.
Thank you. I was looking just a little bit distracted. Lydia has joined us, but apparently may be in the wrong room. So we will start off with just some comments with you and hope that Lydia can get on really very
Lydia
soon.
is on. I can see her. Lydia, can you say something?
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Lydia, welcome and glad you could get on. Would you just please introduce yourself in any way that you choose?
This is Lydia, sign name L. Brown, pronouns they, them. I'm a youngish East Asian person with short black hair and glasses. And behind me is a wood paneled room with windows and a lot of trees. I'm joining from occupied unceded land in the New England area. And I am normally from the Washington, D.C., Maryland area. I am currently the Director of Policy Advocacy and External Affairs at the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network, also Policy Counsel for the Center for Democracy and Technology, and I'm adjunct faculty at Georgetown American Universities.
Thank you so much, Lydia. So why don't we go ahead and get started? So if you look back over the past year, as we all coped with the COVID-19 pandemic, please share with the audience your insights about its deleterious impact on persons with disabilities. And we'll start with Brittany.
Sure. I realize I left out a very important aspect of my description and identity, which is going to inform my response. I'm also disabled. I have cerebral palsy. And to just step back so I can answer your question in terms of the deleterious impact of the pandemic on people with disabilities, I think we have to go back and talk about how the federal government initially framed this pandemic. And it was framed as something that was going to be dangerous to people with quote unquote pre-existing conditions, comorbidities. It was, oh, this is bad, but it won't be that bad for the rest of us. Only those people who are already sick, who have comorbidities, those are the ones that are going to die from it. And I believe that has also informed the fact that we never got a federal mask mandate. We never got federal quarantine policies and procedures because of the way the government was initially framing who was actually at risk from COVID-19. And I think that in itself had a detrimental impact on the disability community because it said that our lives were expendable. And in addition to that, I'm in the process of litigating a case. It's a challenge to the New York State ventilator allocation guidelines, which allow the personal ventilators of chronic ventilator users to be reallocated to people deemed to have a higher likelihood of survival based on a mechanical score known as a SOFA score that stands for sequential organ failure assessment. And SOFA is determined by one's quote unquote likelihood of survival based on the functioning of their underlying organs like their kidneys and their lungs. And obviously if you have a pre-existing condition, if you're disabled, those organs are already functioning at a different rate. So people with disabilities have been challenging these types of crisis standards of care, these types of guidance documents all over the country during the pandemic, which again sends the message that our lives aren't as valuable, that we have to defend ourselves in order to be worthy to even survive. And on top of that, all throughout the pandemic, we've heard that people who live in congregate care settings are more likely to be at risk. We've talked about nursing homes. We've talked about, I also want to specifically mention that jail and prison is a congregate care setting. And it's also a congregate care setting where people with disabilities and disabled people of color disproportionately are. And so that's another way that people with disabilities were negatively impacted during the pandemic. People with disabilities also rely on home care workers disproportionately, and home care workers were more at risk for COVID. You have someone coming into your home. They're essential workers who we also talked about being more at risk during the pandemic. So you have people being more in need of care and being potentially exposed to COVID through their workers. You have people trapped in congregate care settings. You have the government and policies saying that our lives are not as worth living. So the pandemic was harmful to people with disabilities across the board.
Thank you, Brittany. We'll go now to Lydia, and just responding again, your perspectives on the deleterious impact of COVID-19 on persons with disabilities.
This is Lydia. Whenever we talk about disability justice, we are also talking about health justice. When we talk about health justice, we are talking about disability justice. Every single aspect of the COVID-19 pandemic has fallen harder and more directly on disabled people, and particularly disabled people at the margins of the margins. People who are the most likely to be employed in essential jobs, those who are on the front lines and the least likely to receive flexible or even able to have access to remote work opportunities, are largely lower income, wage paid, Black and brown disabled workers. Disabled people are often those who are employed in positions including providing home care and attendant care, are often the people who are employed in positions involving customer service in retail or in fast food or in restaurant work environments. Disabled people, and particularly disabled people of color, are more likely to be subjected to crowded conditions conducive to wider spread and transmission of COVID-19 because of incarceration and institutionalization in group homes, psychiatric hospitals, jails, prisons, immigrant detention centers, and any other place where people are confined and controlled. When we think about who is the least likely to receive medical care, we can also look to literally centuries of not just the passive idea of health disparities, but of active health and medical discrimination, abuse, and neglect rooted in racism, in ableism, in gender-based oppression, and in classism. That disabled people, especially queer and trans disabled people of color, low-income disabled people, disabled immigrants, and other disabled people at the margins of the margins are the most likely to be denied medical care, to receive inadequate medical care, to not be believed when seeking medical care, and to lead lives that are not seen as worth living and therefore not worth saving and not worth protecting. When we think about every single impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, whether in disrupting schools, disrupting work, disrupting home care, disrupting the medical system, disrupting our legal systems, disrupting our communities, every deleterious impact of the pandemic has fallen manifold and exacerbated upon disabled people at the margins of the margins. We cannot talk honestly about injustices or disparities caused by the pandemic if we do not name ableism and racism as central to that conversation.
Thank you, Lydia. And Judy, can you please give us your insights?
I'd like to carry forth on what Lydia was just discussing. It goes without saying that ableism and racism is one of the huge issues that the community is dealing with. The absence, invisibility, and really lack of concern by many, not just within the disability community, because it's an area that we're so diverse in our disability community that many people do not understand the impact of healthcare disparities on people outside of their own particular community, coupled with issues of racism and ableism. I think one of the huge areas we're needing to work on is really educating our community to be able to be more knowledgeable. What I really liked about Professor Dawes's presentation was the historical nature of it and how it really has enabled in a short period of time people to get a broader understanding of where we've been over the last number of centuries. I want to say that I feel that clearly COVID has had a dramatic, deleterious impact on the disability community, but I really also want to talk about the strength of the community. It goes without saying that people like Lydia and Brittany and yourself, Tawana, and many others around the United States, disabled people would have fared much worse if we hadn't been able over the last number of decades to begin to claw ourselves out of the situation that we were in the 1950s and 60s. We need to look at the closure of institutions and what could have happened in a more significant way if in fact we had the Willowbrooks and many others. So while we're looking at what has happened over the year and the significant number of deaths that have occurred for disabled people and disabled people of color, I want to also specifically mention nursing homes, as well as other restricted living environments. But I also want to say that the community, and really all of you on this panel, have been fighting for decades, educating both the disability community, working with getting programs like protection and advocacies and DREDFs and many others, and the amount of work that is slowly beginning to happen at the university level, that we should recognize that we are building and utilizing the knowledge and strength that we've been getting. It's us that have been fighting against the federal rulings and state rulings that would have resulted in even more people dying. It's us that are coming and speaking up about when you talk about people dying from diabetes and hypertension, et cetera. These are all disabled individuals. And so I think we're putting a face on the tragedy of what has happened in a way that I hope will also enable us as we move forward to build on our strength. You know, Brittany talking about litigation that she's currently involved with. This is going on in many places. So we are not the same, I don't want to use the word passive in the past. We are a more organized, more knowledgeable, more powerful group of people today, where ableism and racial diversity, religious diversity is something that is being much more freely discussed with much more knowledge and enabling us to really expand the circle of people who need to also be advocates with the community overall and helping people to understand their value as an individual and their right to be able to fight for equity.
So I thank each of you for those very insightful opening remarks. I just want to give you an opportunity, if you'd like, Lydia, Brittany, and Judy, to comment on what was shared thus far before we move on to our next prompt. Anything that you want to exchange between the three of you?
This is Lydia. I would also add yesterday's announced new guidance from the CDC. Many of us in disabled community are horrified and terrified, not because we don't necessarily want to be able to do activities once we have been vaccinated, but because we know that many disabled and chronically ill people, especially disabled children and youth and disabled elders, remain at higher risk because of underlying immunocompromised or immunosuppressed bodies, and that therefore a loosening of restrictions around masking and loosening of societal expectations around masking will continue to keep our communities at risk, not just of transmission of COVID, but at further hostility, resentment, and retaliation from others in our communities. And that this will, of course, be amplified for people of color, particularly Black and Brown people, and Asian people who faced very particular and exacerbated racism during this pandemic.
Brittany or Judy, any comments? All right,
Except to agree.
go ahead.
Yes.
All right. So I feel that and I am going to say I feel that the disability space is only waking up to the concept and implications of intersectionality. And that's not to be confused with multiple cultural identities. So I will share with you just a couple of slides for our entire audience that give a way of thinking about multiple cultural identities, and a way of thinking about intersectionality. Both Judy, Brittany, and Lydia will have their own perspectives. So if you bear with me for just a second, I am going to share screen and bring up my slides. We think about the term intersectionality, at least the way our center at Georgetown does. We look at this term having its origin with Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a lawyer, a civil rights advocate, and who introduced us to this term in 1991. In her seminal work, she wrote about how a person, because of their membership in multiple social groups, that they may experience discrimination, oppression, and marginalization. And at the time that Kimberly did her work, she was focusing on women, and in particular, Black women. Since 1991, this concept of intersectionality has been used by many in many different arenas, whether it's in health, mental health, human services, education, just across the board. Our observation has been that sometimes those who use the term intersectionality confuse it with multiple cultural identities. And they are not looking at the part of this framework, intersectionality, that Kimberly Crenshaw introduced us to, that takes into consideration discrimination, oppression, and marginalization simply because of one's identity and or identities. And I want to give you just a couple examples before we hear from Brittany and Lydia and Judy. This is a colleague named Andy Arias, who was in DC, now back in his home state of California. And this is clearly Andy Arias' speak, and I can't describe it any differently than that. So this is what he's talking about in terms of multiple cultural identities. I come to the table with my LGBTQ-ness, my Hispanicness, and my disability. Neither overshadows the other. Neither is more important than the other. They are all part of who I am as a person. And he says, don't make me choose. When he speaks about intersectionality, he says, from childhood through adult life, I experienced stereotyping, marginalization, and discrimination just because of who I am, because of my LGBTQ-ness, my Hispanicness, and my disability. And so as we talk about intersectionality today, and Judy and Brittany and Lydia will share with you their perspectives, just want you to keep this in mind, that some things may intersect. However, if we're talking about the concept of intersectionality, we cannot leave out the harm. So I'll stop share right now and come back and really ask Brittany, then Judy, then Lydia to comment on intersectionality and how that also has influenced the COVID-19 experience for people with disabilities across the country.
Did you want me to start again? Okay. I'm glad that you gave the background on the origin of intersectionality and what it means, because I think that people often do confuse it with diversity when it has to do more with the different ways that people are impacted by policies and situations because of their multiple identities or multiple marginalized identities. I think that I'm going to use some personal examples. When this pandemic began, I had some conversations with friends and with relatives and about what were to happen if I were to get sick. I like many people, like many disabled people, was afraid of what would happen if I had to go to the hospital or seek medical care. And some people thought that was ridiculous. They thought, well, you're a lawyer, you can advocate for yourself. Like, what do you mean? What are you worried about? And they left out the fact that what happens if I can't? first of all. And second of all, that no one knows what I do for a living, and it doesn't matter at the end of the day. When you look at me, I'm a Black woman. I'm a Black woman first, and that comes with certain stereotypes and certain perceptions. When I advocate for myself, if I can advocate for myself, I'm often perceived as aggressive. We've seen over and over again, especially in this moment, how Blackness is perceived as being dangerous, and that it can be a death threat in many situations. That's and April Dunn and I listened to Mr. Dawes's presentation, are very similar in many respects. We have the same disability, we're in the same age range. The thing that separates us is class, and opportunities that I've been able to access. So that's an example of intersectionality. But if we were to both go to the emergency room, we're the same on paper in many ways, and in the eyes of the way people perceive us. So that's the way I'm going to illustrate intersectionality in some respects. I also want to talk about how people, Black disabled people and Black people in general, have had to put ourselves on the line in multiple ways throughout this pandemic. As we saw everything play out with George Floyd and the many other people that have been killed by the police during the course of this pandemic, people were marching in the streets in the middle of a pandemic. People who were at higher risk for COVID-19, had all the comorbidities that I discussed, disproportionately people of color, of course, had to, in the middle of a pandemic, both risk their lives in terms of COVID-19 and in terms of police brutality in order to address injustice. So that's another way that intersectionality affects people. The risks that we had to take in the middle of a pandemic were not the same.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that, Brittany. Judy.
Andy is a friend of mine, and I do a program called The Human Perspective. And I believe it was in 2017 that I interviewed him. And I appreciate very much, Tuara, the examples of Andy, because I think he sees himself, his total self, and is able to express his total self. He also will talk about how he is not accepted in other communities. And I think this is a very critical issue, or series of issues. One is, as individuals, our need to be able to look at who we consider ourselves to be. You know, I define myself as a disabled Jewish woman. And those three components for me personally are important. And I look at those three different parts and how it makes my whole. And I've been looking over the years at what areas of me do I feel I'm denied equity, that other groups don't see me as I see myself and as we see ourselves. And the need to really get the various groups, whatever they may be, to recognize what the harm that they are doing to people who are from the LGBT community or the Jewish community or the Muslim community or whatever community, when we are not perceived by them as being equals, where we have difficulty speaking up and out about the way we perceive or experience how we are not really being integrated into these communities, not allowing our whole self to come forward. I think it's one of the major issues when we look at COVID as an example. And the reason why I talk about the issue of causes of death under COVID, where we have seen such a huge percentage of disabled individuals dying, most people are not using the word. And I think that's very important. People need, both we as disabled people and the general society really need to see that we are a political movement and that the use of the word disability is in part a political statement. When we can say that 40 to 50% or more of the people who have died as a result of COVID are disabled individuals, I think that is very important, that we need to be demanding of healthcare systems, et cetera, the recognition of the additional discrimination that we face as disabled individuals. And other communities, I believe, have a responsibility to look within their communities to see whether or not, and Andy Arias, who will talk about how he has not felt included in the LGBT community or in the Hispanic community, et cetera, and how that adversely affects his progress, his mental health, because he sees himself as a whole, but others don't.
Thank you, Judy. And Lydia, please.
This is Lydia. Was just pausing for the interpreter to finish to make sure that we're aligned a little bit. When I think about intersectionality in my own work, it is impossible to separate out what is intersectional or what is not. First, because we all live and inhabit multiple identities and experiences and communities. As Audre Lorde, AUDRE, LORDE taught us, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. And secondly, because all of the work that I do is grounded in the framework and the principles of disability justice, which is not the same thing as disability rights. And a lot of people make that mistake of conflating disability rights and disability justice. Disability justice goes far beyond the frameworks and the tactics of law and policy for advancing change for people with disabilities, and instead centers as its very first principle, the principle of intersectionality. Disability justice also includes, as outlined by its co-creators and by many leaders and path-breaking organizers like Aurora Levins Morales, AURORA, LEVINS, MORALES, Patricia Byrne, Byrne is BERNE, and others. Disability justice contains the principles of cross-community solidarity and of collective liberation. Disability justice understands that just as our movements, our struggles, and our communities are deeply interconnected, that the welfare of domestic workers, of care attendants, of people on the front lines is deeply intertwined with the welfare of disabled people facing institutionalization and incarceration, that the welfare of youth and children is deeply intertwined with the welfare of our elders, that our communities are all deeply interconnected in what Martin Luther King called an inescapable network of mutuality. We are right now situated in a very interesting space following the conclusion of Eid al-Fitr, EID-AL-FITR, last evening, and on the eve of the beginning in just 2 nights of Shavuot, SHAVUOT, both of which are celebrations of community and unity, one within the Muslim community and one within the Jewish community. And both of those opportunities, to me, make me think as someone who's outside of both of those communities, but is connected to many people who are observing, right? What does this say for us? What does community and unity mean for our communities? What does community mean for disabled folks who are often shut out of, isolated, and institutionalized from the communities that we're supposed to come from? What does community mean when within the disabled community, who you are can often dictate what advocacy you can expect to receive? That disability rights advocacy remains dominated by cisgender, straight, white men, often with physical disabilities, and who are otherwise neurotypical. And that for disabled people of color, for neurodivergent disabled people, for queer and trans disabled people, for disabled people from minoritized religious communities who are immigrants, who are working class, we do not see ourselves represented largely among researchers and policymakers, nonprofit executives or management, people who have stable tenured positions in academia, the people who are largely considered to represent disabled people. And so when we talk about our struggles as disabled people of color or people from the queer and trans community who are also disabled, a lot of people stop listening. And they'll tell us, well, you're talking about a niche issue. That's not really a disability issue. You're distracting from issues that affect all of us. And you should have that conversation somewhere separately. And in a physical space that's often literally meant down the hall in a little room back there where we don't have to think about you and where we'll just nod and smile that we know that you're there. It's like, okay, we get some points because we engaged in diversity, but don't actually consider us as peers, as colleagues, as comrades, or as community members. Because everything that affects our lives is considered niche and optional, when for us, it is a matter of basic survival.
I want to say that the points that Lydia has made are very, very important. We're not going to be able to dig more deeply, significantly in this panel. But my hope for this conference is that these presentations really, if taken seriously, will result in those of you who are observers really looking at the lives that you live on a day-to-day basis and the influence that you have, whatever environment you're in, and whether or not you are really listening to some of the important comments that have been made today by everyone who's spoken thus far. Because ultimately, there's a lot of work that we need to do. And a lot of that work really needs to happen by bringing people together to have hard discussions, to look at whether or not people are being excluded from the room and even sent to another room to have a discussion. Because in many cases, depending on the type of disability the person has, they're never at the table. They're not even sent to another room where they're asked to participate, but they're sent to their room in a segregated environment where their views are not considered relevant at all. So I think for me, the benefit of today is listening and learning from voices of people, but also then taking what you're hearing and looking at what role you can play in making change in your lives.
Thank you so much, Brittany, Lydia, and Judy. I think we have enough time for one last go around. I'm not too sure if we have time for questions. So on March 26th of this year, Representative Ayanna Presley, who's a representative from the state of Massachusetts, stated in a podcast. The podcast is called Our Body Politic, and stated the following. And it's a little abbreviated because I didn't take the whole thing. Because the injustices, inequities, and disparities that persist certainly are not naturally occurring. We heard that very strongly from Daniel Dawes. They were legislated. And so if we can legislate hurt and harm, I do believe we can legislate equity, healing, and justice. And so I'd like to reflect from your own perspectives on that statement, particularly within the context of what Daniel Dawes shared with us this morning on the political determinants of health. And this time we'll start with Lydia.
This is Lydia. I want to start by acknowledging upfront that I do not believe you can legislate healing or justice. I usually phrase it this way. You can't legislate morality. You can pass whatever laws you want.
looks like the interpreter disappeared.
This is Lydia. I was pausing for the interpreter to come back. It looks like the interpreter is back. You can pass whatever laws you want, but that doesn't mean that you've changed societal or cultural norms. We've now had the Americans with Disabilities Act on the books for more than 3 decades. We've had the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act on the books for almost half a century. And yet we all know that disabled people continue to face marked forms of discrimination, of prejudice, and violence, interpersonal violence, state violence, corporate violence, and institutional violence. Just because we've passed these laws doesn't mean that we've disappeared ableism. Just because you've passed a law doesn't mean that people follow it, doesn't mean that they change their attitudes, doesn't mean that they change their beliefs, and doesn't mean that you've changed a whole system. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm glad that we have laws like the ADA and the IDEA. I certainly want those laws to exist, and I want them to be better. And I want them to be better enforced. But let's not mistake a legislative process or even an enforcement process for one that is about or can bring about justice. You cannot legislate justice or healing, but you can legislate to move us closer to justice. You can legislate to address past and ongoing harms. You can legislate to attempt to undo some of the generational harms caused, exacerbated, and sustained by systems of law and policy. But you can't use the law itself to create justice, not when laws in this nation were always embedded in a system created to justify land theft and genocide and chattel enslavement and the many other forms of violence that enabled this nation to become what it is today. Our system of laws, and anyone who's ever gone to law school can tell you this. They've learned it. I learned this in law school. Our system of laws was created and refined to justify and enable violence at scale. This is the history of property law. It is the history of civil procedure. It is the history of criminal law. You cannot separate our legal system from the white supremacist, settler colonial origins of this nation. So to say that we can legislate healing or justice, I find laughable. That's not possible. We can legislate closer toward justice. We can legislate harm reduction. We can legislate better conditions under which we will continue to organize. And we must do those things, but we can't legislate justice. Only community can do that.
Thank you, Lydia. Brittany?
Yeah, I agree with Lydia that you can't legislate justice, but I want to, and I realize that's probably a controversial position for me to take as a civil rights litigator, but I want to step back and explain a little bit of what I mean by those terms. I think a lot of times when we talk about justice, a lot of people use the words justice and equality synonymously. And I think that a lot of that framing comes from the civil rights movement. This notion that if we just treat everyone the same, that disparities and all of the bad and negative things will go away. And I think that ableism and the notion of disability and accommodation in particular shows that that isn't possible, that treating everyone the same doesn't remedy harm. I use all the time the example of a fence. If people are different heights and you give everyone one box to stand on, you're still going to have some people who are taller than other people. So that means some people are going to need 2 boxes. Some people can't stand on a box at all. Some people can't stand. And I think we see through law and through policy how uncomfortable people are with the notion of giving some people more than others, or not treating everyone the same. When we talk about affirmative action, everyone's heads explodes. This notion of we have framed repairing harm and fixing injustices with this notion of sameness and treating everyone equally, and that is not justice. And I think that is the way our legal system is often framed, and we don't even achieve that. I'm also going to talk in the context of policing, because I have a lot of experience litigating policing cases. and this is also going to get me in trouble, but for example, I think our notions of justice are often framed on retribution. It's framed in this notion of someone has done something bad, and the way we achieve justice is by getting that person or punishing that person or doing something so that a person is held accountable. And while accountability is important in many respects, and the law can be useful for achieving accountability, accountability in and of itself is not justice. I'm going to use George Floyd again. Again, I'm very happy that his killer was convicted, but that does not bring him back to life, and it does not achieve the broader, it doesn't solve the broader issue of police brutality. It doesn't solve the issues that led to the killing of George Floyd. It doesn't solve racism. I don't think you can train anti-racism either. But so that's what I mean when I say you can't legislate justice. I wanted to provide more examples and more framing of what I mean by that.
I'm not going to get into a discussion on the terminology. I leave a lot of that to Lydia and to Brittany, who I feel really articulate it very effectively. For me, one of the values of legislation, and we're all agreeing that these laws are important, there's a process that's involved in the development of the legislation. And to the extent that we are getting more people like those who are participating in today's convening to be integrated into the process of legislating, that I think also enables us to get stronger laws. And for me, one of the values, for example, in the area of education, of having laws clearly not effectively being implemented and people not being held accountable in every state. But it does enable us to be able to really document the disparities. I think in the area of young people who are incarcerated, it's an area that I feel like we have not dug deeply enough into, that we are not really looking at who those children are and young adults and why they've wound up in the system, which in my view is frequently because of the failure of education, the failure of the system to ensure that those people who have responsibility for these younger people are knowledgeable about what their children's rights are, to ensure that they are getting what they need at an appropriate age. And I'm not talking about segregated systems where people are being labeled incorrectly, but we know, I mean, I was a school teacher, you know the children that are having difficulty, and you have an understanding of what those children should be getting. And we also understand where the system is failing. And this is what I think comes out of legislation, digging deeper, understanding more clearly what needs to be done in order to make these laws work more effectively. And I want to say, that I think legislators themselves in many ways are not knowledgeable enough about some of these problems, because deeper knowledge about some of these issues could result in various oversight work going on to address issues of lack of implementation and compliance, to hold people more accountable. And I use education because I have a reasonable amount of experience there. But another area that I found when I was working in the Department of Ed was the states that had more money were the states that were able to fight back against effective implementation of the law. And so I think, there's just many, many layers. And I think what's really valuable about people like Brittany and Lydia, and what we see, I think, in part as a result of these laws, is disabled individuals who are really entering universities, studying in fields that we historically did not have knowledgeable disabled people in, that really allow not just for these discussions, but ultimately, like in the case of what Brittany is doing, bringing litigation founded on the knowledge of how discrimination is ultimately affecting people and the remedies that we need to be fighting for.
Thank you so much for your insight, your authenticity, and for putting the hard issues front and center on this panel. I think we only have 3 minutes left, maybe just 2. So if you, within 30 seconds, anything else that you want to convey to this audience that's gathered today together? Like, and the time is ticking now.
Brittany, you're muted.
Parting words.
Yeah, but quick parting words.
That's really difficult. I think I want us to not lose sight of all the things we've learned from this pandemic, particularly as it relates to race and disability and the possibility of accommodation. We've seen during the course of this pandemic that accommodations that people with disabilities have been asking for decades are suddenly possible. And as we transition back to quote unquote normal, I want us to recognize that normal shouldn't be the norm, and that normal isn't beneficial to everyone. And so if we can do anything, I want us to be able to keep the positive lessons we've learned from this about access for everyone.
So I thank each of you and also our audience for being with us today. We're at 445 participants. I heard your voices, and our next steps are really looking at action. I think I need to now turn things over to Jonathan. And again, I am so grateful that you were able to join us today and for the spectacular work, amazing work that you are doing now and have done. I think about Judy and myself, just as we're veterans, things that we've done in the past. So thanks again.
Thank you so much, Tuara.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was an incredible discussion. Professor Good, thank you for moderating that. Brittany, Lydia, and Judy, thank you for sharing your experiences, your insights, your criticisms of how things are and how things should be. It was pointed, it was powerful, and it is extremely, I don't really know what to say. Thank you. Next, we are going to hear some remarks from Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, and I will turn it over to the Senator. Thank you.
Jonathan, I think I'm supposed to do an introduction for the Senator, and my slide said that we were going to have a video. So can somebody offer some clarity? Okay, hearing none, I am going to go ahead with the introduction. Kirsten Gillibrand was born and raised in upstate New York. Her home is Albany, New York, where she lives with her husband, Jonathan Gillibrand, and their 2 sons, Theo and Henry. She has an impressive decades-long career as an attorney and legislator in New York State. Kirsten Gillibrand is the junior senator from New York. Prior to being elected to the Senate, she served as the representative for New York's 20th Congressional District as a Democrat from 2007 to 2009. She has and continues to serve the interests and needs of both New York State and the nation as a champion for equity for children, women, working families, marginalized groups, and the communities in which they live, and especially for persons with disabilities. I could go on about Senator Gillibrand's accomplishments, but our time today precludes this. Join me in welcoming Senator Gillibrand.
Hello, everybody, and thank you to Professor Tuara Good for that introduction. I'd also like to thank Marco Damiani, CEO of AHRC New York City, and Pace University President Marvin Krislov for hosting this forum. And thank you to all for joining us in this extremely important, timely conversation on eliminating compounded disparities for people with disabilities and the way the pandemic has magnified the inequities that have been a part of our society for far too long. The pandemic, like all crises, has hit people with disabilities, the LGBTQ+ community, and communities of color particularly hard. For people with disabilities who belong to more than one of those communities, those challenges have only compounded on each other. As we continue to recover and begin to rebuild, the government has a responsibility to not only address the fallout of the pandemic, but also to right the wrongs of the past and put us on a new path forward where everyone has access to the supports and opportunities that they need to thrive. To truly build back better, we must build a more just, more inclusive society with new systems, new policies, and new funding mechanisms to ensure real health equity for people with disabilities. That's why I fought for COVID relief provisions that secured billions of dollars for home and community-based services so that people with disabilities could receive the essential care and support they need to live full, independent lives. I worked with Senator Collins to secure $1.4 billion for the Older Americans Act programs in the American Rescue Plan, funding that is now being used to deliver essential meals and social services to people with disabilities and older adults. And I also worked with Senator Portman to include our legislation, the Ensuring Access to Direct Support Providers Act, in the American Rescue Plan to offer continued Medicaid coverage for the critical physical, mental, and emotional help direct support professionals provide while the patient whom they support is in the hospital. Ensuring that we address the root causes of systemic inequality in our economy and our healthcare system remains a priority for me moving forward. We need to build a system where people with disabilities and their families are able to make decisions based on what is best, what the best solution is, not just the most affordable one. That's why I'm proud to champion the home and community-based services package President Biden proposed in the American Families Plan. I'll be working closely with my colleagues in Congress to realize the full vision of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I'm also a proud co-sponsor of the Disability Integration Act, which would require Medicaid to cover home and community-based long-term care solutions in the same way it covers institutionalized care. For many people with disabilities, the ability to live in their community is made possible by family caregivers who have to balance their responsibilities with full or part-time jobs or give up their jobs entirely, creating financial strain many families can't afford to shoulder. That care work needs to be recognized financially. Passing the Social Security Caregiver Credit Act would allow family caregivers who provide 80 hours of assistance a month to earn Social Security credits. It's also important to me that we address inequities people with disabilities face in the workplace. As you know, under the 14C waiver program, employers are permitted to pay employees with disability wages below the minimum wage. That undervalues their work and their lives. We need to transition to an improved employment model for people with disabilities. I am a strong supporter of the Transformation to Competitive Employment Act because everyone deserves the opportunity to work in an inclusive, integrated environment and earn fair and equal pay. We are at a moment as a nation where we are reckoning with our history of discrimination. It's crucial that the work also addresses systemic discrimination against people with disabilities and the way their experiences intersect with other aspects of their identity. That means challenging the traditional definitions of accessibility and equality. It means incorporating the principles of universal design. And it means addressing the issues to our healthcare system that force people with disabilities to wait longer, travel further, pay more, and deal with more administrative barriers. I look forward to continuing to work with all of you and with groups across the intersections of race, disability, and gender identity to advance these priorities. Thank you all for all that you do. Your advocacy and your efforts make a difference, and you can count on me to lift up your voices and champion our shared priorities in Washington. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your symposium.
Thank you so much, Senator Gillibrand. I think this is a tone that is carrying through this entire symposium and this morning. We cannot go back to the way things were. We need to address and get out in front of experiences and inequities and injustices that have been part of our traditional system for too long. And now we are going to, so thank you, Senator Gillibrand, for those remarks. And now we are going to have a brief slideshow that go over a few interesting facts that you might not have known.